Hello everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon session of performance and translation. I'm Michiko Suematsu, who is to chair this session. Okay, we have three speakers. Each of them will speak 20 minutes, and we have 10 minutes after the final part. After the presentation, we have a question and answer session. Okay, let's start with our first speaker, Eileen Anu. She is a research fellow at National University of Singapore, and her research area is cross-cultural Shakespearean adaptation, translation in intercultural performances of Shakespeare, and digital archiving. Her recent publications include Reading Interculturality in Class, Contextualizing and Studying Global Shakespeare through ASIA in Shakespeare and Digital Pedagogy. She is really keen on education as well. She is also an editor of Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, ASIA, which I'm sure she's going to show you. Actually, I'm working very closely with her for more than 10 years, and I know her very well. And it's really a pleasure to introduce her today. Okay, please.
Oh, yeah.
Hello. Alright, I'll start. Rewriting Shakespeare's play in a different language is not just a linear transfer of meaning from one text to another, but instead makes visible what is deemed as relevant when transposing Shakespeare into a new linguistic, cultural, and aesthetic context. On the intercultural stage, translation becomes a bridge between various theatre cultures, facilitating the audience's engagement with both Shakespeare's play and its adapted double. I will discuss how translation in theatre is understood beyond interlingual reproduction, as the articulation of textuality in performance constitutes the interaction between speech, non-linguistic, and embodied signifiers. Referring to Tan Shu-Wing's Titus Andronicus 2.0, I explore how Shakespeare's text belongs to a larger multi-semiotic system, as Shakespeare is reworded through the active body and voice, gestural language, visual signs, music, and sound. Tang's work retells Shakespeare's play in Cantonese through his signature minimalist and physical theatre, revealing the potentiality of performing the written text. Tang's theatre is informed by a myriad of Western and Eastern performance principles and practices. For instance, Grotowski's Pearl Theatre, Artaud's Theatre of Cruelty, Mime, Jing Chi, Tai Chi, Commedia dell'arte, and dance. The attention to the actor's physicality and the significance of pre-verbal expressivity are also often emphasized by the Hong Kong director. The body, as Tang notes, is the main instrument of expression in the theatre, and the actors are encouraged to make use of 5 forms of pre-verbal expression: the voice, facial expression, breathing, gesture, and spatial displacement before speaking the text. Underpinned by this methodology, Tang made a deliberate attempt to differentiate the verbalization of text from the onstage action by relying on physical theatre techniques, while adopting the folk storytelling form shuo shu. Titus 2.0 premiered in Hong Kong in 2009 to critical acclaim. It was a reworking of Tang's Titus Andronicus, which was staged a year earlier, using Rupert Chan's Cantonese script that closely followed Shakespeare's play. The original Titus production was subsequently adapted for the 2012 Globe to Globe Festival in London. The most noticeable difference in Tang's creative direction was a shift from a largely naturalistic style in his first production to a minimalist approach in Titus 2.0 that was influenced by Euro avant-garde theatrical practices and the presentational techniques of storytelling. Titus 2.0 also used a different script by Kenseth Chong. Although Shakespeare's verse was not preserved in Chong's work, it was praised by reviewers for retaining the beauty of Cantonese while complementing the patterns of Shakespeare's poetic language. To the director, the translation of Shakespeare's text through different registers of Cantonese functions as a performative strategy that conditions an audience's watching experience through intralingual spectatorship. Tang's philosophy in the use of Cantonese in his adaptations of Shakespeare has always been to strike a midway between current colloquial spoken language of today and that of highly literary language of the past, so that the intellectual attention of the audience would be consistently monitored with a distance. Translation in this sense is not merely a linguistic domestication or the contemporization of Shakespeare for a local audience, but a means to showcase the intralinguality of Hong Kong's vernacular language on the world stage. Although my examination of Titus 2.0 is not focused on interlingual translation, it is worth noting that the choice of language in Hong Kong correlates to identity politics. Communicating in Cantonese, English, and/or Standard Mandarin connotes specific cultural and socio-political identification. Cantonese translations of Shakespeare imply an expropriation of Shakespeare by the local theatre culture, as the difference between English language, Mandarin, and Cantonese Shakespeare in pre- and post-Hanover Hong Kong is an expression of cultural affiliation and agency. In Hong Kong's multilingual context, Cantonese represents a medium to enunciate the self. The increase of Cantonese performances of Shakespeare in late 20th century Hong Kong underscores translation as a performative mode, able to assert cultural distinctions amid the region's changing political and cultural landscape. Textuality in this production was articulated as spoken word, nonverbal expression, and written text. Tang's use of shuoshu produced a heightened distinction between textual orality and the act of narration. The bifurcation of Cancer Chong's Cantonese text in performance was established in the opening act. As the actor-narrators sat motionless with their hands on their knees while narrativizing exposition, dialogue, and dramatic action for all of Act 1. As announced in the opening lines of the performance, Shakespeare's Titus was reshaped through a storytelling framework, signaling it as an intercultural rewriting of Shakespeare's play. Act 1, which condensed the plot and most of Titus and Tamora's speeches in Shakespeare's Act 1, Scene 1, was presented through first-person and third-person narration. This dramatic device was adopted throughout Titus 2.0 as Shakespeare's story, and the actions, emotions, and dialogue of Shakespeare's characters were recited and performed by individual actors or as an ensemble. The standardized black costumes, nondescript stage makeup, and the allocation of dialogue in the script according to the actors' names further emphasized this actor-narrator presentation. Actors could not be readily identified with a particular Shakespearean character, but formed parts of a collective chorus. So while this performance style at times detached the audience from the violence that was verbally communicated, the strong dependence on narration to visualize action simultaneously drew the audience into the performance through their imagination. The actor-narrator character dynamic alluded to Bragg's epic theatre and his technique of producing an alienation effect in performance, as an interpretive gap was formed between the audience and the presented illusionary narrative. When conceiving this mode of acting, Tang was also influenced by Gao Xing-Qian's tripartition of the actor, that is, the person, the neutral actor, and the character. This concept, as Yong Lilan explains, dismantles the binary of actor-character so fundamental to Western critiques of role, character, and the individual subject in Shakespeare's plays. Tang's distinctive approach to narration obscures this dichotomy, as he points out that there are overtones of the actor playing the character in the narrator. Here, storytelling requires the audience to distance the narrator from the actor, but correspondingly recognizes the interconnectedness of the performer's fictional, structural, and dramaturgical roles. The interplay between these multiple roles challenges the conventionalized understanding of character representation in realist theatre, and also expands the way an audience engages with Shakespeare's text in performance. Storytelling, while operating as a verbal articulation of narrative action, need not always be read as a performance of orality. The telling of a tale, as Jack Lecoq observes, is accompanied by the gestural evocation of images, and communicated through the storyteller's body, both vocally and physically. To him, the art of storytelling is a performance of poetic bodies, where movements are not simply mimetic. Following this, the actor's facial expressions, gestures, and inaction during the narration segments of Titus 2.0, foregrounded the actor's codified body. A dichotomous opposition between the corporeal and the textual has often dogged criticisms of performances of Shakespeare in Asia. However, this binary assumption is confronted by Tang's minimalist approach, which values and emphasizes the symbiotic relationship between the body and text in non-Anglophone productions of Shakespeare. The presentation of narration in Act 1 translated violence in Shakespeare's text into verbal description and expressivity. It was only in the subsequent acts that gestural language interacted with spoken text. The contrast between stillness and movement in the opening scene was heightened during the final act. Mirroring Act 1, the actor and narrators resumed their positions on chairs that were repositioned in a straight line. A wash of red floodlights, was the only visual representation of bloodshed on the stage. And since the scene was performed through storytelling, the audience was denied action at the most horrific moment of Shakespeare's play. Instead of diminishing the performative force of this adaptation, the narration of violence intensified the dramatization of cruelty that perhaps could only be achieved solely through physical presentation. This performance strategy that split yet combined the actor with the character and the narrator allowed the viewing focus to oscillate between action and speech, urging audiences to reinterpret embodied and verbal enactments through silence and verbosity, activity and stasis. Instead of separating the text from the body, the coalescence of narration and physical theatre meant that linguistic and dramatic action in Titus 2.0 was constantly being remediated and reframed by the other. It is worth noting that for a non-Cantonese speaking audience, the overarching narrative style accentuated the switch between watching the performance and reading its English surtitles. Surtitles or subtitles used in live and recordings of productions engender a complex viewing position that engages and at the same time disconnects the audience from the unfolding performance. These two modes of perpetual experience, according to Dennis Kennedy, express the condition of intercultural spectatorship, as the surtitled production underlines the extra dramatic awareness of a performance's cultural, textual, and dramatic plurality. The parallel vision of rereading Shakespeare's text in and through translation allows an audience to locate the different exchanges and hierarchies that can exist in intercultural performance, drawing attention to the positionality of an audience. Translated surtitles projected alongside the performance defamiliarize Shakespeare's text, while placing Shakespeare's play in the co-presence of its foreign adaptation through retranslation. Subtitles as such should not be seen as a paratext passively accompanying dramatic action. Rather, it evinces the doubleness of Shakespeare in translation by creating a spectatorial context that prompts comparative interpretation. Music reflected another form of signification that was situated in between the verbal and embodied representations in Titus 2.0. A mixture of traditional instruments, like the two-string erhu fiddle and the mini Spanish cajon, and unconventional percussive objects like glass goblets, tin cans, and chains were used by musician Nelson Hui to create a striking soundscape. Hui, who was seated on stage, composed live music that punctuated the action and narration, and at other instances interacted with the actor narrators to produce a haunting and multi-layered system of non-linguistic signification. The affect of music and sound also meant that the portrayal of violence was experienced on a sensory level. Let me just show you. Take, for example, the beginning of Act 5, Scene 3. Okay, the atonal sounds produced by bottle caps, plastic bottles, metal plates, as you saw in the video, created a raw and grating effect. As the onstage action was minimal and not accompanied by speech, the discordant oral setting which preceded the start of Shakespeare's Act 5, Scene 3 seemed to convey the presence of violence before the verbalization of it. This improvisational live music was noted by Howard Choi to be a performance by itself. Different from incidental music, Hui's disjunctive soundscape functioned to heighten, contrast, and accentuate the actor-narrator's bodies and verbal recitation. While these sonic accents helped shape the audience's response to the performance, this effective application of music also offered audiences an alternative means of assessing the production through nonverbal or incorporeal signs. For non-Cantonese speakers, sound and music allowed the allusion to violence to be evoked through a highly emotive idiom. The textured musicality of Titus 2.0 was not limited to Hui's composition, as the delivery of lines took on an expressive vocality that was markedly performative. For instance, in Act 3, Scene 2 and 3 in the production, the cadence of the actor-narrator's speech patterns, which led to a gradual crescendo, became a way to depict Titus's descent into madness. This pivotal change in Titus's character was first signaled by all the actor-narrators reciting the lines of the scene polyphonically. The actor-narrators then overlapped each other's words using different vocal tonalities, projection volumes, and delivery speeds, culminating in a single actor-narrator repeating the entire lines of the scene in a rapid pace. Let me just show you the video so you can see what I mean. I'll stop it here for now. It goes on for quite some time, but you get the gist. All the chaos of the scene and Titus's psychological state were also presented through the actor-narrator's repetitive and erratic gestures, as you saw. The oral presentation of narration brought into focus the performativity of language. The heightened expressivity of spoken speech in Titus 2.0 produced an idiosyncratic acoustic environment that was often juxtaposed by and interjected with prolonged pauses and vocalization, relaying violence and emotion through sound and silence. The use of vocal articulation was amplified in the staging of Lavinia's rape, which is elided in Shakespeare's Act 2, Scene 3. There was no physical violence portrayed, as the actors stood apart from each other, presenting the scene without any bodily contact. Rather, the assault on Lavinia was implied through guttural sounds produced by the actors' heavy breathing and panting, which created an unsettling effect. A persistent drumming, the actors' contorted bodies and voice, and the audience's imagination jointly animated the charged enactment of Lavinia's violation, without reducing the female body to spectacle. Titus 2.0 consisted of many moments of inaction and prolonged pauses, the longest lasting over 6 minutes before Titus instructed his family to prepare for the climactic feast. While these pauses disrupted the dramatical flow of Shakespeare's play, they were equally central to intensifying the dramatic tension on stage. It was in these moments of stark silence and physical stillness, operating in contradistinction to the theatricality of the performance, that an interpretive space residing between Shakespeare's play and the new performance text was opened. Theatrical elements such as music, sound, both produced by the actors' bodies and instrumental, though established through a concomitant relationship with the spoken text, are not restricted to the confines of textual interpretation or performative translation. More than just affirm that translation is not the derivative of an original, Titus 2.0 shows how translation can be contextualized as a remediation of written text through other expressive mediums, a process that is realized in and as performance. Translation, as seen in Titus 2.0, is both transformative and relational. It extends the connotative dimensions of Shakespearean textuality while embedding the translated text into a nexus of signification beyond Shakespeare's play. The relationship between embodied action and the embodiment of language in tongue's adaptation augments our understanding of translating Shakespeare, as translation in Titus 2.0 is both an interlingual and performative action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. All the non-realistic strategies and almost surreal strategies on the production are clearly defined. And also you mentioned the silence and still moments, which remind us of yesterday's director's symposium. And I'm sure there will be more questions in the later session. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to our next. Our next speakers are Fumiaki Konno and Tetsuhito Motoyama. Professor Konno is Associate Professor at Meiji University. His research covers extensively from 19th century English adaptations of Shakespeare to performances of Shakespeare in Japan. His recent publications include Reimagining Shakespeare in Contemporary Japan, a selection of Japanese theatrical adaptation of Shakespeare. Actually, this book featured the three directors we met yesterday, and also he co-authored the Shakespeare Company Japan and Regional Self-Fashion in William Shakespeare in 21st Century Culture, Politics, and in Japan and Regional Politics and Leadership. Sorry, and Tetsuhito Motoyama is professor at Waseda University. He has been working on the reception of Shakespeare in Japan, especially on the stage. His publication also actually the same titles, Reimagining Shakespeare in Contemporary Japan, a selection of Japanese theatrical adaptation of Shakespeare, and also the Shakespeare Company Japan and Regional Self-Fashioning, William Shakespeare and 21st Century Culture, Politics, and Leadership. Actually, I was very impressed with the idea of three daughters of your translation. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Seamatsu. You may recall there's a reference to translating in Midsummer Night's Dream. In Act 1, Scene 1, as Helena vents her envy towards Hermia, she cries out, "Were the world mine, Demetrius being baited? The rest I'll give to you to be translated." Translate here means both to transfer, in this case to give something, everything but Demetrius to Hermia, and to transform, that is to become Hermia. This idea of transformation is central to the play, which C.L. Barber associates with May Games and describes as a region of metamorphosis, where in liquid moonlight or glimmering starlight, things change, merge, and melt into each other. He also describes the carnivalesque nature of these metamorphoses, which are in a medium and in a moment where they perceive structure of the outer world breakdown, where the body and its environment interpenetrate in unaccustomed ways, so the seeming separateness and stability of identity is lost. The act of rendering a text into another language, likewise, is not only transferring it in the sense of making it accessible to a different readership, it is also transforming it into something that can shift the dynamics between the hypotext and hypertext so that the latter informs the former. Lawrence Venuti contrasts what he terms transparent domesticated texts translations that read fluently and erases the presence of the translator, with foreignized translations that acknowledge the foreignness of the original text by disrupting the cultural codes that prevail in the translating language. Venuti argues that the transparent texts exclude what Mikhail Bakhtin called the carnivalesque because of an anxiety about the simulacral status of the translated text and the threat it poses to an individualistic concept of authorship. Foreignized translations, on the other hand, reject the dominant by developing affiliations with marginal linguistic and cultural values in the receiving situation. It is then the foreignized translation that transforms the text, disrupting the given in the original text and the culture in which it is located, and even challenging the presence of a single author. This paper will explore this notion of foreignization, not in printed texts, which Venuti has done extensively, but in the representation of a translation on stage. In particular, it will examine a staging of A Midsummer Night's Dream by the Shakespeare Company Japan, who I think many of you had the pleasure of experiencing yesterday. A theater company for whom local identity and culture are pivotal. In their production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, a carnivalesque energy disrupts the structure created by and blurs the identities constructed in the text. As a result of this disruption and blurring, there is a reaffirmation of the local identity.
Before discussing what the translated text attempts to do and how the performance returns this, a brief look at the founding of the Shakespeare Company will clarify how some of its staging practices are closely tied to its identity. The SCJ has performed to date over a dozen productions of Shakespeare in the dialect of Tohoku, the northernmost region of mainland Japan, where the company is also located. It was started exactly 30 years ago in February 1992, not from the desire of a few theatre practitioners or academics to translate works of Shakespeare to the general public, but from demand among the local people. Professor Shimodate Kazumi of Tohoku Gakuin University, the head of the company, has written the SCJ, before it was formed, was quintessentially like a donut. We had no translator that could serve as its center. There were just supporters comprised of audience members. It was not that we created the theatre company then so to an audience so that we could present our work. The driving force that led to the forming of the SCJ was the conviction that Shakespeare inherently belongs not to academics or to theatre practitioners, but is for the people. And so there is a need to do Shakespeare not in an alienating standardized language, but in the actual language they themselves use. This conviction lives on in the company's highly collaborative creative process. And Shakespeare's works are adapted and translated not by Shimodate alone, but by a group of locals who usually gather at the local hot spring to work on the translation. The translation thus produced then is further translated or transformed by the performers, as is explained in the following explanation from the program for the London production of their Island Othello. Director Kazumi Shimodate initially writes scripts for the plays in his mother tongue, the dialect of the coastal town in Miyagi Prefecture. But after actors are assigned their role, they adjust the lines to their own dialect. The use of familiar everyday language is what makes the company's productions so accessible and enjoyable for audiences in the Tohoku region. This collaborative process in which the translated text is transformed into an exciting mishmash of diverse variations of the Tohoku dialect is one of the most fascinating aspects of the SCJ and integral to the discussion that we follow.
Their production of Midsummer Night's Dream closely follows Shakespeare's plot, but drastically indigenizes the play. Athens becomes Shogama, or Shomo, a town located along Matsushima Bay, while the woods become the island Nonoshima. The fairies become creatures of the sea, with Oberon or Obe seen as a massive tuna, and Titania or Taita as a curvaceous octopus. Instead of Puck, a kappa, which is a water demon or deity that looks like a teenage mutant ninja turtle gone bad, serves Obe, and instead of love and idleness, it is the genitals of a whale found by a particular island that tampers with the affections of Taita and the young lovers. Shimodate writes that this idea came to him in a dream in which he saw a jolly kappa straddling a blue whale. And bottom or bun transforms not into an ass, but an lantern anglefish. What is of particular interest to us today is the fact that not all the characters have their lines translated into the Tohoku dialect. The nobility of Shiomo, with the exception of Demetrius or Ryasu and Helena or Rina, speak standardized Japanese. Oberon and Titania, being the king and queen of the sea creatures, speak predominantly in standardized Japanese, although Oberon often lapses into the Tohoku dialect. Japanese linguist Kinsui Satoshi states in his study, Virtual Japanese, that there are specific roles assigned to the standardized and to the regional language when both are brought together in works of literature or translation. Standardized language, in his argument, represents the educated or ruling class with whom the reader is encouraged to assimilate. Marginalized languages, on the other hand, are tied with the undereducated and subjugated, who are rejected as the other. The SCJ's translation, though assigning clear roles to the two languages, deviates from this. It is those who are associated with stability that are given lines in standardized Japanese, while those who have the potential to create mischief and havoc are made to speak in the local language. This can be gleaned from the fact that Lysander and Hermia, who are mutually in love with each other, are categorized as the former, whereas Demetrius and Helena, who are of the same social class but serve as the reason confusion ensues among the four lovers, belong to the latter. Even more obvious is how Oberon code switches, depending on whom he's speaking with. He shifts from standardized Japanese to the Tohoku dialect the moment kappa is in his presence. For example, in Act 2, Scene 1, after a heated exchange of words with Titania, she storms out, and Oberon's lines, "Well, go thy way, thou shalt not from this grove till I torment thee for this injury. My gentle Puck, come hither," shows no dialectical signs. But the moment Puck appears, the lines are presented in the local language. Titania, on the other hand, does not code switch, while Bottom is her companion, nor do Lysander and Hermia in the company of Demetrius and Helena. There are only two moments in which Titania code switches in the translated text. The first is when she berates Oberon for his infidelities, and the second is when she imputes the rise of toxic air to the appearance of Oberon. In both instances, she is putting forth the seeds of contention and chaos. It could be said that the translation identifies characters who have the carnivalesque energy to create misrule through the use of dialect. This, however, is what the printed text indicates. Performance, which is very much a collaborative effort rather than the product of a single author, creates another dimension of misrule altogether. Spivak argues that chance, as much as language produced by others, produces self-meaning that is as pluralized as a drop of water under a microscope. What constitutes this chance in this case of SCJ's production is the performers. Beverly Curran, in discussing Bungei Kyokai's 1911 production of A Doll's House, writes of the physical presence of the actress Matsui Sumako, creating a dissonance between the new woman constructed in Ibsen's play and the Japanese woman in the social imagination. Curran discusses the divide that exists between theater translation. In other words, translated plays on the page and translation theater, or these plays in performance. In a similar way, with the SCJ's production of Midsummer Night's Dream, there was a dissonance between the roles that the text assigns the actors and the linguistic habits or the words of, or in the words of Sonia Masai, the voice of the actors. She writes of the importance of a mode of non-linguistic understanding that relies on the sound of the foreign language translated as much as on other non-linguistic aspects. She also explains that the voice in performance can encourage both speakers and listeners to rethink voice, not as a given or fixed, but as the plural in-between challenging and generative practice of voicing. The voice in SCJ's production is similarly performative, not because it simply constructs identity by conveying the sounds of the foreign language translation, but because it rewrites the identities dictated by the translated text.
This is most evident with the actor who plays Oberon. And in Act 2, Scene 1, Oberon observes Demetrius and Helena in the woods and comments, "Fare thee well, nymph, ere he do leave this grove, thou shalt fly him, and he shall seek thy love." The actor lets slip features of the dialect, especially at the end of the words and lines. "Iroiro dana" is replaced by the lifting and elongated "iroiro dana." The shift from the two vowels to a single high vowel and the transformation of a voiceless consonant into a voiced consonant can be seen when denai-uchi becomes deneuchi. And there is another replacement of a voiceless consonant with one that is voiced, and the introduction of an altogether different expression when shizukoku turns into shizukoku. Yagana replaces ageo. The voice or the
よし。あらばがこの島でねうちに姉ちゃんの方がすっごく追いかけ回されるようにしてやっか。
The voice or the linguistic habits of the performer defines the authority of the translated text, disrupting the pattern dictated by its use of dialect. Because of the discord between the use of dialect and the very varied linguistic backgrounds of the performers, the performance becomes an embodiment of the Carnivalesque act of overturning the order found in the text. Admittedly, this may elude the audience. Oberon is a character who code switches which makes it difficult for the audience to say with confidence that the deviation from the text is actually a deviation. Lysander and Theseus, however, are the characters whose speech show no trace of a dialect. This makes steady slips that the performance make blatantly obvious to those in the audience. When lamenting the trials of being in love at the beginning of the play, Lysander compares love that is chosen to being momentary as a sound. The translation reads "oto mitai," but the performer voices the second consonant so that it becomes "oto no yoni." Likewise, Theseus at the beginning of Act 5, Scene 1, exchanges words with Hippolyta in standardized Japanese. That is a very loose summation of the lunatic, the lover, and the poet. He declares, "I was originally a poet, but the sight of Rita has cured me of this frenzy." Three of the consonants in the actual words spoken, "Wadashi wa motomoto shijin da ga, Rita o mite kara futsu ni natta," have become voiced.
音のように明らかに
Such moments to the ears of the audience upset the order and the relationship between standardized Japanese and the Tohoku dialect, as is fashioned by the text. One transforms, or going back to the words of Barber, melts into the other, and the perceived structure of the outer world breaks down, so that the production itself metamorphosizes into an embodiment of the carnivalesque. At the same time, they become moments in which the misrule and muddle confronted by the characters in the play are conveyed in not just a visually but orally tangible way to the audience. Venuti writes, the only prestige that a translator can gain comes from practicing translation, not as a form of personal expression, but as a collaboration between divergent groups, motivated by an acknowledgement of the linguistic and cultural differences that translation necessarily rewrites and reorders. Translating, like any writing, is usually practiced in solitary conditions, but it links multitudes, often in the most unexpected groupings. Translation used in the theater is, as explained earlier, a collaborative effort in its practice as well as in its effects. But it is especially so in the case of the Shakespeare Company Japan. The festive and foreignizing nature of the translation and performance for their Midsummer Night's Dream is a product of the open and synergetic creative process that they practice, in which the translation undergoes numerous transformations at the hands of a team of translators and of performers. Foreignizing translations, thus collaboratively produced, open up possibilities in the ways the festive nature of Shakespeare's comedies can be staged. In the roundtable discussion yesterday, Shimorete spoke about how he has come to believe that what should be conveyed through a Shakespearean translation is the sensuality, vitality, and warmth of the language. The power of the language is certainly a central concern in SCJ's Midsummer Night's Dream. In the program, Shimorete writes that the inspiration for this production came as he heard the sounds of the local Eya-dotto folk music in his mind. The sound and rhythm became the underlying energy of the play, as it opens with a scene in which Kappa and the other sea creatures dance and repeatedly chant the words Chako Chako to the rhythm of local folk music. This not only establishes the tone and concept of the production, but also impresses upon the audience the power of the local language. The foreignizing translation that makes use of the local language then transforms the play into an expression of the indomitable and intractable energy of the local language and culture, imposing its sound and cadence upon what many assume to be the dominant mainstream language. We will end the paper by inviting you to experience the energy of the Tohoku dialect, which you may have already done during the stage reading yesterday, as we play you a clip of the opening scene. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the illuminating speech, talk. I'm sure I watched the performance, but I failed to notice the difference between the use of local and standard Japanese, and also I failed to notice code switching of overall. And I'm just wondering why, and maybe it was so hard for me to understand the local dialect. We really, outsiders, had to make efforts. So maybe That was a reason I get to notice. Maybe I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'm not from Tohoku, so I have to very closely study the video and the
I
text.
see. Yeah.
Kono-san is from Tohoku, so
So it certainly subverted the dynamics of the standard in local languages.
it did.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, our third and final speaker is Irina Kostianchuk. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Okay, she is a PhD student of theatre studies at Osaka University. Her academic interest is in contemporary theatre, stage adaptation of classical literature, and problems of cross-culturalism. Before coming to Japan, she has worked as a lecturer, senior lecturer in Department of History and Theory of Arts at Belarusian State Academy of Arts. Okay. Her recent publication includes Crossing Boundaries, Translation and Adaptation of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in Contemporary Japanese Theatre. Okay. Irina, please.
Today, my topic is translation, cultural identities, or staging Shakespeare in contemporary Japanese theatre. And to analyze some of the key elements of Shakespeare translated performances, I will focus on two Japanese adaptations of Coriolanus. First is Yuki Ninagawa's version, performed by Ninagawa Theatre Company at Saitama Art Theatre in 2007. And the second is Matori Miura's performance produced by Chiton Theatre Company at Shakespeare Globe Theatre in London as part of the 2012 Shakespeare International Festival, World Shakespeare Festival. Before analyzing this production, it's vital to take a cross-cultural approach when summarizing the theoretical concepts and problems that arise throughout translation. There are many definitions of what translation is. For example, Peter Newmark defines translation as transferring the meaning of the text to another language as the author intended. Meanwhile, translation is also understood as the conveying the meaning of the text in the source language by means of the equivalent text in the target language. According to Young, translation is a noticeable change of the source that results in a new appearance, but is still inevitably linked to the original. And the question is whether the result is only a new and different rendition or the original product, or whether it can be evaluated as either gain or loss if compared to the original. However, they reproduce all of the expressions from the original work. One must place the new text in context that preserves the original spirit of the work. Nevertheless, it's up to the translator and later to director in deciding whether or not to use a particular expression. It's important to remember that translation in arts is an act of creativity, especially in theater when the director conveys the story and message in another language, another country and culture. The cross-cultural understanding of translation is also based on the idea of primacy in the linguistic system. The language of art, religion, and drama is a second-level system, what means language that has been edited to the original in a more complex way. Natural languages are, according to Yuri Lopan, primary modeling system, meaning that literary translation to the systems that have a natural language at their basis and that acquire supplementary superstructures that creating languages of the second level. In this context, I think theatre could be considered a third-level system, which includes all three categories of translation as defined by Roman Jakobson: intralingual, interlingual, and intersemiotic. And today I would like to pay attention on intersemiotic categories. One more thing which also play an important role in analyzing translation from a cross-cultural perspective is cultural realities. The idea of cultural realities is to identify which concepts in other culture are untranslatable and have no equivalent. In other words, cultural realities are the names of objects of material culture inherent only to certain nations and peoples, facts of history, states, institutions, the name of national and folklore heroes, etc. When overcoming these problems, directors, at first translators and then directors, often use a specific method of stylization, namely the deliberate construction of the literary text following the principle of organizing linguistic material and characteristic external speech thing inherent in the particular social environment, historical era, literary movement, genre, and individual writing style of the author, who is elected as an object of imitation. When there is a desire to place work from one particular culture into the international context or the space of another culture, stylization often requires that the original text acquires cross-cultural characteristics. In both the Yukio Ninagawa's and Moto Miura's productions of Coriolanus, cross-cultural stylization is clearly used. However, in these cases, stylization as a means of translation was applied as a phase of creating the spectacle. In translating the action from ancient Rome to feudal Japan, Ninagawa changes the context of performance, where a metaphorical scenography does not provide any reference to the specific place or time of action. Ninagawa creates a stage starting with large stairs and towering gates. In the play, the stairs provide a clear visual representation of the power struggle as the Roman patricians move up and down them, while entire battles take place in the same stairs. In addition, with the help of mirrors placed on both sides of the stairs, the director distorts the space of the scene and interpretation of the characters. For example, in the battle scene, the mirrors create the effect of scale and while merging the actors and blurring their identities. The scene of actors spreading across the mirrors reaches this number of infinity, blending individuals into one for the crowd. Although the stairs and mirrors not only appear to increase the number of people stay on stage, but by changing their reflection, reduce or elevate the importance of the characters in the scene. For example, in the scene of Coriolanus' last conversation with his mother, what you can see on the slides, The once formidable and powerful woman kneeling at the foot on this enormous staircase looks not so powerful considered to her son standing at the top. As the conversation progressed, however, Coriolanus Kurosawa slowly but inevitably loses his status in the eyes of other warriors, and he descends to the steps. As he becomes down from his physical and symbolic conquered heights, he elevates his mother, transforming himself from a great and sometimes hardy warrior into an obedient son, the boy of tears, Nakimushi Kozo, as Aufidius called him. In addition to the semantic interpretation of the text, this scenography also brights the European and Asian worlds. In the first scene of the play, Buddhist statues are placed on the top of the stairs, and through the action, the colors, shape, and imagery on the huge gates change, giving references to different cultures and places of action. These gates symbolize an entrance to an ancient Roman and Coriolic, the entrance to a Buddhist temple, and the gateway between the world of living and the dead. Continuing with cross-cultural aspects of translation, it's worth noting that translation is always related to intervention. According to Delgado, intervention can be invisible or, in contrary, aggressive. Translation can decontextualize and domesticate a foreign culture, what we can see on these examples, or keep it as something distant and different from the target culture. Compare it to Ninagawa's large-scale production. Moto Miura's production was minimalistic with only 5 actors. Coriolanus, played by Dai Ishida, is surrounded by an abstract chorus of 4 people who play all the other roles. The baguettes were one of the key elements of props, functioning as swords, flute, and sustenance. Given that the play focuses on Coriolanus' relationship with common people of Rome, the production appears to the center around the famous phrase, bread and circuses, while being a reference to Shakespeare text where the conflict between the Romans and the protagonist aimed the people's hunger. However, while Shakespeare divides the characters into supporters and opponents of Coriolanus, Miura's version rather shows a symbolic division into the chorus or crowd and the renegade who opposes them. In Ninagawa's staging, there is a clear division between patricians and plebeians, between Romans and Coriolis, which is vividly expressed through the costumes. The Romans are dressed in black hakama and hawk chlamydes, while the opposing Aufidius and Coriolis wear white robes. Here, there are 2 opposing camps that, however, create a single image of belligerent states and people who differ only in the color of their clothes. While Ninagawa production is considered samurai, Miura's performances gives more references to Buddhism and Kyogen. The motif of Zen Buddhism can be found in the image of Coriolanus, namely that the actor Dai Ishida mainly performs with standing eye. You can see it's a type of this woven straw hat. Thus, Miura translates the figure of the ancient Roman general into Japanese monk character of the Edo period, which called Komusto. Turning to the etymology of the word Komusto, which means priest of nonsense or monk of emptiness. It usually was a poor bigger monk without any social status in society. And the first two kanji, gyomu, with gyo, nothing, empty, false, and mu, nothing, without. And the last kanji means Christ and monk, soul. Thus, Miura's Coriolanus is not a brave warrior, but rather a man who has chosen to seclude himself from the world, hidden in the shadow of this head basket, and perhaps atoning for his own and other sins. However, doesn't this metaphorical message also reflect the essence of Shakespeare's character, who ultimately perishes because of the futility of endless battles? What did Coriolanus die for? What is not for something equally empty and false under the bravura name of Great Rome or Corioli? In Minagawa version, Coriolanus is filled with a sense of superiority, which can be seen in the fight scene on the enormous stairs, when the blood-soaked hero continues pushing easily his enemies in different directions. He then sits as if on a throne, lifted into the arms of his comrades. In Miura's adaptation, the character looks rather broken and even miserable when, in the first scene of his appearance, he is carried, particularly dragged, across the stage. The movements of Toshiaki Karasawa's Coriolanus are sweeping, confident, and proud, while Dai Ishida's Coriolanus' entire body speaks more of insecurity and trying to appear more substantial. Many researchers argue that translation of a work is not just a translation of the characters. In fact, the translator does not translate the meaning, but the message. In continuation of this reasoning, the four masks used in the No and Kyogen performances serve as an important message to translate in the stage version of Miura. Therefore, the actors who play both patricians and plebeians while reciting the text periodically cover their faces with masks in certain episodes. To the ordinary viewer, this mask most likely evoke a sense of foreign culture being intervened, but in actuality, the audience probably simply does not know the additional meaning. At the same time, each of these masks in Japan's theater culture has a specific name, meaning, and interpretation. For example, the mask on the face of Yohei Kobayashi, the one of Horus who also plays Aufidius, is called Yaseo Toko and means emaciated man, and represent a ghost suffering in the hell. Perhaps from the beginning of the production, the director and the actor create a message that the characters, whether Aufidius or other participants of Rome and Corioli, will go to hell when they die. Another performer, Shie Kubota, wears a mask on the back of her head and sometimes turning her back to the audience. Her mask is called Otobide, expressing the majesty and ferocity of God, representing a god of thunder and protector of Buddhism and also a ghost. Since all the masks surrounding Coriolanus refer to the mythical ghosts, demons, gods, the idea of the protagonist speaking to the demons, both internal and external, appears. The use of the mask in the spectacle, in addition to their metaphorical meaning for the disclosure and interpretation of the characters, also allow us to see the double meaning of Japanese staging, where the actors, in a style of the traditional comic theatre, again tell the tragic story of Shakespearean characters. This is not just another cross-cultural adaptation of Shakespeare's text, but from the stylizing form of Asian theatrical performance unfamiliar to ordinary European audience. This is likely why many European critics and theatre commentators have perceived Miura's production as an inappropriate luminary, elements of which are admittedly present in the spectacle. In conclusion, both spectacles are not just simple translation, but intertextual phenomena of joint cultural contact, where references of different cultures unite, enrich each other, and make the audience understand the play from the position of their own culture and through the prism of cultural borders. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Irina, for discussing two very different Coriolanus. Their strategy to Japanese Coriolanus is very different. And also, but I always also think the second production, second Coriolanus, somehow connects to Eileen's example of Tansho's Coriolanus in distancing audiences and how to disintegrate characters and that kind of thing. Can be related, I'm sure. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we got a few more minutes. Maybe we can take a few questions here or comments from the floor. So please, you.
I have a question about the production of Midsummer Night's Dream. You talked about how the two couples, one of them spoke in standardized Japanese and one in the Tohoku dialect. I'm thinking about the panel yesterday where one of the panelists was talking about translation as a kind of directorial action, that you were thinking about the story you're telling and who you're telling it to and what you want to say. Okay. And I'm wondering if you know what was the kind of thinking behind dividing language along those lines of chaos and order, and if perhaps there was some desire to invite audience sympathies for certain characters, or what was the thinking behind that division of language?
I haven't really talked to Shimon about this. So this is just our guess, but I think what you say is very much true. I think the characters that use the local dialect, I think they are the ones that the local people would be feeling sympathy towards or feeling closer towards, whereas the characters using standardized Japanese, it's a little bit alienating towards them. So they are the characters who, when you look at the printed text, they are the characters who maintain order or who represent stability in the text. But you also get the feeling that they're a little bit difficult to get closer to, whereas the messy characters are the ones that are more appealing to the audience, maybe.
So there's an invitation to embrace the chaos of it.
Yes, yes. That's how we read the production and the text itself. But
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions or comments?
Thank you for 3 fascinating papers. And I've got a question that's kind of for all of you. and that's that you were talking about and showing us remediating the text, augmenting the text. You were using all these words to show an incredibly creative and original response to Shakespeare's texts. And that has one set of meanings for me, because I have Shakespeare's text very firmly in my mind. But I'm wondering about, presumably Japanese audiences will often see these shows without actually knowing Titus or Coriolanus, or maybe even Midsummer Night's Dream, in which case this isn't so much a rethinking for them. This is what they think Shakespeare is, but kind of isn't. So really briefly, can you talk about what do we do with the amazing, fresh Japanese genius here, and where does Shakespeare fit in?
I'll start and speak very briefly, and then I'll pass the microphone on to my feeling is that I think for a lot of people who don't know the text very much, Shakespeare is a kind of alienating figure almost. It's it's only for the educated and the academic. And so I think these kinds of productions that we've been talking about that bring the text closer to, or bring the plays closer to the audience, is a way to familiarize the audience with the text. And then teaching Shakespeare in the classroom, what I often find is that if I take the students to the theater, or if I show them film versions of Shakespeare, then they get interested in reading the text, and they say, well, I want to look at the text now. And then they might read a translation first, and then they might get really interested and say, now I think I'm ready to look at the actual English version of the text. So that's how I see how these productions in relation to the original text.
For the Cantonese version of Titus, I think in Hong Kong is quite a unique situation as well, because pre-1997 Hanover, Shakespeare is often taught in schools. Titus, of course, is not the most popular text to be taught in classrooms. However, I think how that particular director uses Cantonese language is very interesting, because it really becomes about cultural agency. Even now, still in Hong Kong, you don't really get you don't have bilingual performances. Very, very rare. And in the past, when they did have bilingual performances, it was an experiment on using language and what language meant in terms of its relationship to producing Shakespeare in post-colonial Hong Kong. But I agree with you in the sense that to a lot of audiences, this actually could be their first experience watching Shakespeare, even teaching in the UK. When I showed my students Korean Shakespeare, to them, that was their first Shakespeare performance that they watched. And they're from England, you know? So it's true, theatre, I think, is sometimes that's their first gateway into liking Shakespeare and liking the text, and then later going back to the English text because they like the performance that much. So that's the value there. I hope that answered the question.
Honestly speaking, I'm not really familiar with audience, and especially like school audience. But what I know, for example, from my country, yeah, it is like the same. At first, when the people who doesn't know that lot of Coriolanus and Twelfth Night, even Hamlet, for example, when they see something interesting. And I think these examples we talk about, yeah, I think it's kind of interesting examples. And when people see this type of interesting thing, yeah, they motivated to know more. But unfortunately, for example, not about Japan or like Hong Kong, but for example, in Belarus, not many of them will read Shakespeare, even in translation. not talking about like in English. And I think concerning to the, for example, Coriolanus, this translation is kind of different. It's not about only text, but it's about exactly identity and culture, and it much more closer to Japanese people to understand these messages. But for foreigners, it's not Shakespeare, but what is it exactly? It's a good question.
Thank you. Any more comments or questions?
We'll ask it outside so we don't miss our coffee.
Oh.